At the end of the 20th century, on a pitch-black night in an unremarkable house in Houston, Texas, a chilling and heinous bloody murder was quietly brewing. Dean Arnold Corll was about to carry out evil atrocities on two teenagers he had lured to his home. This man, known as the Candyman by the community residents because he often gave out free candy to children, had won people's trust in this way. On this terrible night, there was also the presence of another victim, a boy named Elmer Wayne Henley, who was one of Corll's criminal accomplices. Although this teenager had already been involved in multiple criminal activities with Corll, this time he felt sympathy and pity for one of the victims, and as a result, he was also tied up. However, through a series of pleas and promises, Henley was untied, but on the condition that he had to participate in the torture and murder of the victims. As the killing was about to begin, at this decisive moment, a surge of defiance rose from deep within Henley's heart. He couldn't bear to watch more innocent teenagers get hurt, so he seized Corll's pistol and fired several shots at the devil without hesitation. On December 24, 1939, Corll was born into an ordinary family from Fort Wayne, Indiana. His home was filled with frequent arguments because his father and mother had completely different ideas about raising children. The father was very strict with the kids, while the mother obviously favored and protected them. It's easy to imagine that growing up in such a family, the children would feel confused and contradictory. So, Corll's mother decided to divorce. She wanted to get the children away from this environment, so she sold the house and moved to Memphis, Tennessee with young Corll and his brother living in a trailer. Perhaps Corll's mother still believed in that man, and she didn't want the two children to lack fatherly love. Not long after the divorce, she remarried Corll's father and moved together to Pasadena, a suburb of Houston, Texas. However, this marriage didn't last long either. A few years later, the couple divorced again, and the mother still obtained custody of the two sons. Despite this, the two boys still maintained regular contact with their father. The discord between their parents led to Corll being introverted and serious from a young age, rarely interacting with other children. But he had a tender heart and was extremely sensitive to any form of criticism or rejection. This is also the reason why some unhappy families choose not to separate, because children really need a childhood filled with parental love. In 1953, after Corll's parents divorced for the second time, his mother married a traveling clock salesman, and then the family moved to the small town of Victoria, Texas. His half-sister was also born. Here, Corll's mother and his stepfather started a small family candy company, which was initially operated out of the garage. Corll went to school while participating in the company's daily operations. He and his brother were in charge of operating the candy-making machines and packaging the products. Their stepfather was responsible for sales, often going to Houston to sell most of the products. From 1954 to 1958, Corll attended Victoria High School. At school, he was regarded as a well-behaved student with satisfactory grades. Although he was still a bit introverted, according to his classmates' memories, he occasionally went on dates with girls. In the summer of 1958, Corll graduated from high school. Shortly after, he and his family moved to the northern suburbs of Houston because it was closer to the main market for their candy business. They also opened a store called Pecan Prince at their new home, a name derived from the brand of their family products. In 1960, Corll moved to Yoder, Indiana, to live with his grandmother. There, he established a close relationship with a local girl, but for some unknown reason, he turned down her marriage proposal. After living in Indiana for nearly 2 years, in 1962, he returned to Houston to continue helping with the family's candy business. In 1963, Corll's mother divorced his stepfather, and then they set up a new candy company named Corll Candy Company. Corll was appointed vice president of the new family business, while his brother was appointed secretary and treasurer. That same year, a teenage male employee complained to Corll's mother, alleging that Corll had made sexual advances towards him. To prevent the spread of gossip, she fired the teenage. On August 10, 1964, Corll was drafted into the U.S. Army. He was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for basic training, and then sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, for radio repairman training. Eventually, he was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. According to official military records, Corll's service in the Army was unblemished. However, he did not enjoy military service and applied for early discharge, citing the need for his family business. The Army approved his request, and after serving for 10 months, he was discharged on June 11, 1965. Because the Corll Candy Company, created by his mother, and Pecan Prince, his former stepfather's business, had been in constant competition, Corll immediately threw himself into the candy business upon his return, facing the growing public demand for his family's products. In fact, it was during his military service that Corll first realized he was homosexual, and he also experienced his first homosexual encounter there. After returning to Houston, Corll's behavior changed subtly. He often spent time with teenage boys. That same year, Corll Candy Company moved across the street from Helms Elementary School. Corll became known for giving out free candy to local children, especially teenage boys, a practice that earned him the nicknames the Candyman and the Pied Piper. He also installed a pool table behind the candy factory, where employees and local young people would gather. It was noted that he frequently flirted with several teenage male employees there. In 1967, Corll met 12-year-old David Owen Brooks, a 6th grade student and one of the many children he gave candy to for free. Brooks often interacted with Corll and the various teenage boys who gathered behind the candy factory, and he regularly went on trips to the beaches of South Texas with different young people. Later, Brooks said that he was drawn to Corll because he was the first adult male who didn't mock his appearance, and Corll would give him money whenever he needed cash. Brooks also had a very poor family environment, with his parents frequently arguing. Coincidentally, during this period, Corll treated him like the father he had imagined, and as a result, Brooks developed unusual feelings for Corll. Starting in 1969, the two gradually developed a sexual relationship. In 1968, after the failure of Corll's mother's third marriage, she and his half-sister closed down Corll Candy Company and moved together to Colorado. Although his mother often talked to Corll on the phone, the two never met again. At this time, Corll, having received training as a radio repairman in the Army, found a job as an electrician in Houston. On September 25, 1970, an 18-year-old college freshman named Jeffrey Connon disappeared while hitchhiking with another University of Texas student to his parents' home in Houston. 3 years later, on August 10, 1973, his naked body was found under a boulder in Mustang Island Beach. According to the medical examiner's speculation, Connon died of human strangulation and asphyxiation caused by a rag gag in his mouth. At the scene of the burial, Connon's hands and feet were tightly bound with nylon rope. Shortly after Connon's disappearance on December 13th, Brooks lured two 14-year-old boys, James Glass and Danny Yates, away from a religious gathering in Houston Heights to Corll's apartment in Yorktown. The two young men were tied to Corll's torture board, and Corll intended to sexually assault them. Initially, Brooks discovered and stopped him, then Corll promised to give Brooks a car in exchange for his silence. Brooks agreed, and the two young men were subsequently sexually assaulted, strangled, and buried in a boat shed rented by Corll on November 17th. Brooks received a green Chevrolet Corvette, and then Corll threatened Brooks, saying that since he had killed the two young men, Brooks had become his accomplice in murder, and if anyone told the police, he would also be arrested. However, Corll then made another offer to Brooks, saying he would pay him some money, but the condition was that Brooks had to continuously lure other boys to his apartment. On January 30th, 1971, Brooks and Corll encountered two young boys, Donald and Jerry Waldrop. Initially, they were driven by their father to a friend's house to plan the formation of a bowling league. After finding out their friend was not home, they began walking back. However, the story ended with the two young men being lured into Corll's van and taken to the apartment he was renting, where they were raped and strangled. Between March and May of the same year, Corll kidnapped and murdered 3 victims living in Houston Heights, burying their remains behind the boat shed. Brooks was involved in each kidnapping. One of the victims was 15-year-old Randall Harvey, last seen by his family on the afternoon of March 9th as he rode his bicycle to Oak Forest, where he worked part-time as a gas station attendant. Harvey was taken to Corll's apartment and shot in the head, killing him. The other 2 victims, 13-year-old David Hilligius and 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle, were kidnapped and killed together on the afternoon of May 29th. After learning of their sons' disappearances, Winkle's mother and David's parents frantically searched for the boys, even printing reward posters offering money to anyone who provided information on the boys' whereabouts. One of Corll's criminal accomplices, 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, initially volunteered to distribute these posters, trying to reassure the distraught parents that the boys' disappearance might have another explanation, rather than them truly being missing. On August 17th, Corll and Brooks met Brooks' 17-year-old acquaintance Reuben Watson Haney while returning home from a movie theater in Houston. Brooks persuaded Haney to attend a housewarming party at Corll's new residence on San Felipe Street, which he had moved to the previous month. Haney agreed, was taken to Corll's home, strangled, and buried in the boat shed. In September, Corll moved to an apartment on Columbia Street. Brooks later stated that at this address, he had assisted Corll in kidnapping and murdering two unidentified young men. In the winter of 1971, Brooks met Henley and introduced him to Corll. Henley was originally lured to Corll's residence as an intended victim. However, Corll apparently thought the young man would make a good accomplice, so he also made Henley the same offer he had made to Brooks: $200 for any boy he could lure to his apartment, while telling Henley that he worked for a white slavery gang. Henley later said that for the first few months he ignored this tempting offer but still maintained an acquaintance with Corll, gradually beginning to see him as a brotherly figure because he admired Corll's work ethic and considered him a man worth confiding in. In early 1972, due to Henley and his family's poor financial situation, Henley accepted Corll's offer. His first participation in a kidnapping occurred in late February or early March, when he met a boy on the street, promising to take him to smoke marijuana and luring him to Corll's house. At this point, he had no idea that the boy would be sold to a slave gang, but in reality, the unidentified boy became Corll's prey. On March 24th, Henley, along with Brooks and Corll, encountered his 18-year-old acquaintance, Frank Aguirre. He called Aguirre over to Corll's van, inviting the young man to drink beer and smoke marijuana with the three of them at Corll's apartment. Aguirre agreed, and they smoked marijuana together. However, suddenly, he noticed a pair of handcuffs left on the table by Corll and felt something was wrong. Aguirre wanted to run away, but it was already too late. Corll pushed him onto the table and cuffed his hands behind his back. At this point, Henley realized that Corll's intention was definitely not to sell Aguirre to a slave gang. But when he heard Corll admit to having raped, tortured, and killed the previous victims he had assisted in kidnapping, he understood that he had already stepped into an abyss from which there was no turning back. On April 20th, Henley assisted Brooks and Corll in kidnapping another young man, 17-year-old Mark Scott, who was one of Corll's intended victims because he had deceived Corll in a previous deal. They forcibly grabbed Scott, who was very tenacious. Even after being abused for several hours, the young man still tried to stab Corll with a knife. But eventually, when he saw Henley pointing a gun at him, Scott realized he could no longer resist. He gave up struggling and resigned himself to his fate. Initially, Henley did participate in the murders as an uninformed party. But as multiple murders occurred, his psychology became twisted. He gradually became curious about how much patience humans could have, so he was by no means a victim who was always forced to participate in the murders. Before June 26th, Henley also assisted Brooks and Corll in kidnapping and murdering two young men named Billy Balch and Johnny Dellum. According to Brooks' testimony, both young men were tied to Corll's bed. After being tortured and sexually assaulted, Balch was strangled to death by Henley, while Dellum was shot to death by him with a pistol. During Corll's residence on Schuler Street, he, along with Brooks and Henley, lured a 19-year-old young man named William Lettinger to their residence. The young man was initially tied to hooks on the wall and then to a plywood board, where he suffered torture and abuse at the hands of Corll. Brooks later claimed that after he persuaded Corll to release Lettinger, the next time he entered the house, Henley knocked him unconscious. Corll then tied Brooks to the bed and repeatedly assaulted the young man before finally releasing him. In the summer of 1972, Corll killed two victims. The first victim was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, who was last seen leaving a party in Heights shortly before midnight on July 19th. The young man was brutally beaten in the chest with a blunt object, then strangled and buried in the boat shed. Around August 21st, 19-year-old Roy Button was kidnapped on his way to work as an assistant at a shoe store in Houston. His mouth was taped shut, and he was shot twice in the head before being buried in the boat shed. It wasn't until 2011 that they were identified as Corll's victims. On October 3rd, Brooks and Henley encountered two young men, Wally J. Simonet and Richard Hembree, who were walking home. They were lured into Brooks' car and taken to Corll's apartment. That night, Simonet secretly called his mother's house and shouted the word "Mom" into the receiver before the call was disconnected. The next morning, Henley accidentally shot Hembree in the mouth, with the bullet exiting through his neck. A few hours later, both young men were strangled and subsequently buried in a mass grave. Sometime in November, 18-year-old Willard Branch disappeared while hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston, and his body was buried in the boat shed. On November 11th, 19-year-old Richard Kepner disappeared on his way to a phone booth. He was strangled and buried on High Island Beach. Between March and November 1972, at least 10 teenagers aged between 13 and 19 were murdered, with 5 buried on Mustang Island Beach and 5 in the boat shed. On January 20th, 1973, Corll moved to Wirt Road in the Spring Branch area of Houston. Within 2 weeks of moving into this address, he killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. On March 1st, Corll moved out of this apartment and briefly stayed in an apartment on South Post Oak Road before moving to the address 2020 Lamar Drive, which his father had vacated in Pasadena. Between February 1st and June 4th, Corll had no known victims killed. Records show that he suffered from hydrocele in early 1973, which may have been the reason for his inactivity during this period. Additionally, around the time of Lyle's murder, Henley went to Florida with his uncle, a long-distance truck driver, and moved to Mount Pleasant, apparently to distance himself from Corll. Perhaps at this point he had already begun to have thoughts of rebellion, but after so many murders, he could no longer return to normal life in society. Starting in June, Corll's killing frequency increased sharply. Henley and Brooks later testified that the brutality of the murders he committed while living on Lamar Drive had increased. Henley later compared Corll's escalation to being like bloodthirsty, and added that he and Brooks would instinctively know when Corll announced he needed a new boy, because Corll would become restless, smoke, and make fidgeting movements. On June 4th, Corll and Henley kidnapped 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. The teenager was last seen by his father on the street. After 3 days of abuse and torture, Lawrence was strangled and then buried in Lake Sam Rayburn. 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn was kidnapped, strangled, and buried in the same place. On July 6th, Henley started school, where he met 15-year-old Homer Louis Garcia. The next day, Garcia called his mother, saying he was going to spend the night with a friend. Instead, he was shot and bled to death in Corll's bathtub and was buried in Lake Sam Rayburn. 5 days later, 17-year-old John Sellers from Orange County was tied up, shot, and buried on High Island Beach. In July 1973, Brooks married his pregnant fiancée, and Henley temporarily became Corll's only accomplice. Between July 19th and 25th, he assisted in the kidnapping and murder of 3 young men. Henley claimed that these were the only 3 kidnappings that occurred after he became Corll's accomplice, in which Brooks did not participate. On August 3rd, Corll killed his last victim, 13-year-old James Stanton Dramala from South Houston. The boy was kidnapped while riding his bicycle. In Corll's home, he was tied to a torture board, raped, tortured, and strangled with a rope, and then buried in the boat shed. Brooks later described Dramala as a blonde, blue-eyed little boy, and he even bought him a pizza. On the evening of August 7th, the whole story came to an end. Henley invited 20-year-old Timothy Cordell Kelly to a party hosted by Corll. Since Kelly also knew Corll, he accepted the invitation. Brooks was not present at the time. After the party started, Corll did not make a move but drank and smoked marijuana with the 2 of them. Then Henley and Kelly left, promising to return soon. They drove back to Henley's home together. After getting out of the car, Henley heard a commotion coming from the home of his 15-year-old friend Rhonda Louise Williams, so he walked towards her house. Williams was bandaging her sprained ankle at the time, and she was being beaten by her drunk father. Then Henley invited Williams to rest at Corll's home. Around 3 a.m. on August 8th, the 3 young people returned to the apartment, but Corll was very angry because he did not allow girls in his apartment at all. Corll told Henley in private that he had ruined everything, and Henley explained that Williams had argued with her father that night and did not want to go home. Then Corll became a bit silent. He offered beer and marijuana to the 3 of them, but he did not touch it himself. About 2 hours later, the 3 young people passed out. When Henley woke up again, he found himself lying on the ground with his wrists cuffed, his mouth taped shut, and his ankles tied together. The other 2 young people were in the same condition, and Kelly's clothes had been stripped off. Then Corll noticed Henley was awake, so he removed the tape from Henley's mouth. Henley protested in vain, accusing Corll of his actions, but Corll was unmoved. He once again expressed his anger at Henley for bringing the girl back and said he planned to kill all 3 of them after assaulting and torturing Kelly. Corll said, "Man, you brought this girl here," and then shouted, "I'm going to kill all of you, but first I'm going to have some fun." Next, Corll dragged Henley to the kitchen, pressed a pistol against Henley's abdomen, and threatened to shoot him. Henley tried to calm Corll down, promising that if Corll released him, he would participate in the torture and murder of Williams and Kelly. After about 30 minutes, Corll agreed. He untied Henley's restraints and then took Williams and Kelly to his bedroom, tying them to both sides of the torture board. Then Corll handed Henley a hunting knife and ordered him to cut off Williams's clothes, saying that while he would rape and kill Kelly, Henley also had to do the same to Williams. So Henley began to cut off Williams's clothes, and Corll took off his clothes and started to torture Kelly. At this point, both victims had woken up. Kelly began to twist and shout, and Williams raised her head and asked, "Is this real?" Henley replied, "Yes." Williams continued to ask, "What are you going to do?" Then Henley asked Corll if he could take Williams to another room. At this point, he already had the idea of releasing his friend, but Corll ignored him. So he grabbed Corll's pistol and said, "Dean, you've gone far enough. I can't go on anymore. I can't let you kill all my friends." Corll approached Henley and said, "Kill me, you won't do it." But facing the threatening approach, Henley chose to shoot, hitting Corll in the forehead. However, the bullet did not fully penetrate his skull, so Corll continued to charge at Henley. Henley fired 2 more shots, hitting Corll in the left shoulder. Feeling the pain, Corll turned and ran out, hitting the corridor wall. Henley then fired 3 more shots at Corll's waist and shoulder, and he slowly fell to the floor, dead on the spot. At 8:24 a.m. on August 8th, Henley called the Pasadena Police Department. He told the operator on the phone, "You'd better come over now. I just killed a man. The address is 2020 Lamar Drive." A few minutes later, a patrol car arrived. Williams and Kelly were sitting by the roadside crying, while Henley was staring blankly across the street. After seeing the police, he told the officer that he was the one who made the call and indicated that the body was inside the house. The officer then confiscated the pistol, put the 3 young men into the patrol car, and went into the house. After finding Corll's body in the hallway, he returned to the car and took the 3 to the police station. Kelly later told the detective that before the police arrived, Henley had said to him, "If you guys weren't my friends, I could have gotten $200. During his detention, when initially questioned about Corll's killing, Henley recounted the events of the previous night and that morning, explaining that he had fired the shots in self-defense. The statements of Kelly and Williams corroborated his account, and the detective questioning Henley also believed that he had acted in self-defense. Henley went on to say that for nearly 3 years, he and Brooks had been helping Corll kidnap teenage boys for him to rape and murder, some of whom were their own friends. He said that initially, he thought the boys he kidnapped would be sold to an organization in Dallas for homosexual acts, sodomy, and perhaps later murder, but he soon realized that Corll was killing the kidnapped victims. The police were initially skeptical of Henley's claims, considering the only victim in the case to be Corll, attributing it to drug-induced violent behavior. However, Henley was very insistent. When he recalled the names of 3 boys, Coble, Hilligiest, and Jones, and said that he and Brooks had kidnapped them for Corll, the police found his story plausible, as these 3 teenagers were all listed as missing. In addition, the floor of Corll's room was covered with thick plastic sheeting. The police also found a torture board with handcuffs tied to 2 corners and nylon rope tied to the other 2 corners, as well as a large hunting knife. There was a roll of the same type of transparent plastic on the floor, a portable radio mounted on a pair of dry batteries with the volume turned up, an electric motor connected to loose wires, 8 pairs of handcuffs, thin glass tubes, and long ropes. Corll's van also gave a similar impression. The rear windows of the van were sealed with blue curtains. In the back of the vehicle, the police found a coil of rope, a beige carpet stained with dirt, and a wooden box with air holes drilled in the side. The rear of the van had a pegboard wall with several rings and hooks, and a wooden box was also found in the backyard. There were several strands of human hair in this crate. At the request of the police, Henley agreed to accompany them to Corll's boat shed in southwestern Houston, where he claimed several victims' remains could be found. Inside the boat shed, the police discovered a partially stripped stolen Chevrolet Camaro, a child's bicycle, a large iron drum, water containers, 2 bags of lime, 2 shovels, a damaged rake, and a large plastic bag filled with teenagers' clothing. It was here that they found a large number of victims. Accompanied by his father, Brooks went to the Houston Police Department on the evening of August 8th and made a statement denying any knowledge or involvement in the murders. However, he admitted to knowing that Corll had raped and killed 2 teenagers in 1970, and he mentioned the names of 2 young men, Reuben Haney and Mark Scott, who had been seen with Corll before their disappearance. On the morning of August 9th, Henley provided a full written statement detailing the process of him and Brooks' involvement with Corll in the kidnapping and murder of many young men. In this confession, Henley admitted to personally killing about 9 young men and assisting Corll in strangling the others. He said that there were only 3 murder cases in which Brooks did not assist them. That afternoon, Henley accompanied the police to Sam Rayburn Lake, where he, Brooks, and Corll had buried 4 victims killed that year. 2 more remains were found in shallow, lime-soaked graves near a dirt road. Inside a lakeside cabin, the police discovered a second plywood torture board, rolls of plastic sheeting, shovels, and a bag of lime. On the evening of August 9th, Brooks confessed to the full extent of his crimes, admitting to participating in several murders and assisting in several burials, although he continued to deny direct involvement in the killings. When talking about the torture board used by Corll to restrain and torture the victims, Brooks said, "Once they were on the board, they were as good as dead. It was all over. All that was left was screaming and crying." Speaking of the actual murders, he stated that witnessing the victims' deaths did not bother him, adding, "I've seen it so many times." And then he agreed to accompany the police to locate the victims' remains. At that time, in terms of the number of victims, this killing spree was the worst serial murder case in the United States, although this record was broken a few years later. The victims' families first levied severe criticism at the police department because after the boys went missing, the police only listed them as runaways, not missing persons. They believed that the boys were not considered worth any significant investigation. If the police had launched an investigation early on and established a special task force, there would not have been so many victims. On August 13th, a grand jury in Harris County convened and heard testimonies from Williams and Kelly, as well as from a victim released by Brooks, Ridinger. They recounted their experiences, and investigators also testified at the hearing, detailing the various statements and confessions provided by Henley and Brooks in the days following Corll's death, as well as the assistance in overseeing the excavation of the victims' remains. After listening to more than 6 hours of testimony, the grand jury indicted Henley on 3 counts of murder and Brooks on 1 count of murder on August 14th. The bail for each defendant was set at $100,000. Henley was not charged in connection with Corll's death, and the prosecutor ruled that Corll's death was in self-defense. On July 1, 1974, Henley went on trial in San Antonio, charged with 6 counts of murder committed between March 1972 and July 1973. Following the advice of his defense attorney, Henley did not testify in court. His lawyer cross-examined several witnesses but did not call any witnesses or experts to testify in his defense, as it was deemed unhelpful. The prosecution called 24 witnesses, including Kelly and Ridinger, and presented 82 pieces of evidence, including Corll's torture board and one of the boxes used to transport the victims. Other incriminating testimonies came from officers who read Henley's written statements. On July 15, 1974, both attorneys presented their closing arguments to the jury. The prosecution sought a life sentence, while the defense argued for an acquittal. In the closing arguments submitted to the jury, the district attorney apologized for not being able to sentence the perpetrators to death and added that this case was the most extreme example of inhumanity he had ever seen. The jury deliberated for 92 minutes before finding Henley guilty of all 6 murder charges. On August 8th, the judge sentenced Henley to a total of 594 years in prison to be served consecutively. He was transferred to Huntsville Prison to begin his sentence formally. On February 27, 1975, Brooks went on trial, charged with 4 counts of murder committed between December 1970 and June 1973, but ultimately only charged with the murder of 15-year-old Lawrence in June 1973. His defense attorney argued that his client had not committed any murders and attempted to portray Corll and Henley as the active participants in the actual killings. The assistant district attorney flatly rejected the defense's arguments, telling the jury, "This defendant was involved in this killing from the very beginning, this killing spree. He tells you that if it weren't for an accident, he was a cheerleader. That's what he tells you about his role. You know he was involved." Brooks' trial lasted less than a week, and the jury reached a verdict in just 90 minutes. On March 4, 1975, he was found guilty of murdering Lawrence and sentenced to life in prison. At the sentencing, Brooks showed no emotion, although his wife burst into tears. Henley is serving a life sentence at the Mark Stiles Unit in Jefferson County, Texas. Since July 1980, his consecutive parole applications have been denied, and he will next be eligible for parole in October of this year. Brooks was serving a life sentence at the Terrell Unit near Rosharon, Texas. On May 28, 2020, he died of complications related to COVID-19 at a Galveston hospital at the age of 65.